Hey, que es la que hay, mi gente? It's Rocky here from SpeakSpanishFaster.com. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at 7 proven ways to help you memorize Spanish vocabulary. All right, so when it comes to memorizing or retaining new words, we know it's important. Like if you want to speak a new language, you have to remember the new words. But a big mistake that most people make when it comes to learning Spanish and memorizing vocabulary is they look up lists of words like, oh, let me find the 1,000 most popular words in Spanish or most common words in Spanish, most used words in Spanish. And they try to memorize that list. And there's many reasons why that's just not going to work. And I'll touch on some of that in this video. But if you do that, don't do that. That's not going to help you actually, number one, speak Spanish, but number two, you're not going to retain the information. All right. Now, a lot of us, it's not our fault, really. Like we are kind of taught in school that we should remember this noun, this verb, this noun, so that we could pass a test or whatever. And we might actually pass the test, but we don't end up speaking Spanish. So what I show you here today is going to be different than what a lot of people have learned in the past. So pay attention, all right? The first way, it's pretty basic, listening a lot. Tiene que escuchar. You have to listen a lot, all right? If you want to not only learn to speak Spanish, but actually learn new words and retain those words. But then the argument comes, right? There's pretty much 2 ways you can consume here. Escuchar, to listen, is a form of consumption. It's a form of input. There's 2 inputs, listening and reading, 2 outputs, speaking and writing. In the beginning, you just want to focus on the input of listening. You just want to focus on input, all right, listening and reading. So listening and reading a lot in Spanish, preferably at the same time. So watching a Spanish video with subtitles, reading a Spanish book while also listening to the audiobook. Those are some of my favorite things to do. But there's this argument kind of like, do we do deliberate learning, which is where we are listening with a pen in hand, a notepad, writing down words that we don't know, stuff like that, deliberately focused, or passive listening, where we're just listening as we're like doing random things, going to sleep, going for walks, driving, listening. Okay. So for adults, the best way to learn is deliberate learning. And especially if you're learning a new language, okay, you want to practice deliberately. So you want to focus. You want to have a pen, pencil in hand while you're listening and reading at the same time. In the beginning, especially though, in the beginning is the most important. Why? Because you don't have the database of words in your brain yet. So listening passively is not really going to help you because you might be able to pick out a word here and there, but a lot of it's just going to go over your head. And that takes away from consuming comprehensible input. So that's kind of key to learning Spanish, is consuming content that you can comprehend. And the only way to really comprehend that when you're first getting started is by looking at, Spanish text, English text, comparing them and things like that. Adults have the advantage over children. Children have many advantages over adults when it comes to learning a new language. The one advantage that adults have is that we've learned a language before and that we know how to read, we know how to analyze things, so we can compare translations, transcriptions, and all that. So in the beginning, you want to do deliberate listening and reading at the same time. All right. Now, as you get better, you can implement more passive learning. And then eventually, you won't need any more deliberate learning as you get better, because then you'll be able to actually walk and listen to podcasts and understand everything. So the key, though, is the listening. Okay, you have to kind of the input, I should say, the listening and the reading. You have to download these words deliberately And that gets into part 2 is writing down the words in a journal that you do not understand. But when you do that, you want to write the words in phrases, not just the word. Again, the reason, now I'm going to kind of close that loop that I opened in the beginning, all right? The reason why memorizing a list of words is not going to work is because there is no context to those words. So when we don't have the context, we're not going to be able to recall the word, and more on recall later. So you should have like a journal. You should write the words in phrases. So like, let's say I say a word like, I say a sentence like, yo voy a hablar contigo. Voy a hablar contigo. And the word you don't know is, let's say, hablar, even though hablar is an easy word. But let's say you don't know hablar. You wouldn't just write hablar. If you heard that sentence and you didn't know hablar, but you knew voy a and conmigo or contigo, then you would write down the phrase, because if you know voy means I am going to, pretty much here, and contigo means with you, and then you have the word hablar written there, then it'll be easier to recall that information when you see the word hablar, and you'll be able to say, okay, voy a contigo. Oh, I'm going to speak with you. I'm going to talk to you. So it would also help if in your journal you put like the date of your whatever piece of content you're consuming, whatever that day is, and the title of the piece of content. So it could be like video with Rocky here. And you could put the title of the video. So that way, when you are going back to study, you will be able to recall that word, all right? So another thing you can do is when you write the word Spanish, usually I split this page in half, Spanish on the left, English on the right. But we're writing in phrases. That's the most important. And tip 2, that's tip 2, all right? Writing in phrases. And I'm going to come back to this journal because there's some other cool things that you can do with it. And it's crazy. All you need is a little handy dandy notebook. There are some technology things that you can use to practice your vocabulary, but or to work on your vocabulary, work on your memorization of these words. But a lot of times you could just go with a simple, cheap little notebook. All right. Especially if I know a lot of people that watch my channel are older. They're not as savvy with the tech stuff. So the journal a lot of times is the main thing they enjoy. Now, tip number 3, spaced repetition. So I know this is a pretty popular topic in language learning. Why? Because it's very, very powerful. And I think it's powerful, not just language learning, but learning anything. Okay, so spaced repetition basically is about exposing yourself to content over and over and over and over again. So if I learn something today, if I don't review that within like a week, then I'm going to forget it because the brain can only hold so much information. So basically the brain, it's not necessarily that I'll say it kicks out the stuff that it doesn't need to know, because you have to think about humans, right? Our evolution, really, we would have to focus on things that would keep us alive. Anything that wasn't based on our survival would just be kicked to the side. So even though language learning isn't a matter of life or death, it's still a matter of the brain saying, hey, do I need this information? And if you don't review, then you're going to forget it. And this is why we forget a lot of the stuff we studied in school. Like I can't remember any of the math stuff pretty much that I did in school anymore. I don't remember anything I did in school anymore. Why? Because I'm not using it in my daily life. So my brain is like, you don't need that. We'll kick that out. So spaced repetition, basically you're reviewing over different time periods to kind of actively continue to recall this information, which will be another tip later. But right now, just focus on the spaced repetition. Now, there are different types of technology that you can use. One of my favorite tools on the computer is a tool called Anki. This is a spaced repetition app. I think it's free. it might cost a little or it might be free. I can't remember, but I know there's other apps and stuff that you can use. But basically what Anki does is you could put vocabulary words into it and it'll serve you those words, and it has some algorithm where it serves you the words based on when you need to review them. So if I have a new word, it'll show me the new word tomorrow so that I review it. You want to do like tomorrow, then it will show me again in 3 days, then it'll show me again in a week, then it'll show me again in a month. But it will basically show you this information so you retain better. It's very, very powerful. But you don't need Anki. Like, you could just pull out your journal and you can go back through these words. You don't just go through them at random. Like, randomly, if you're on the toilet or something, like pick up your journal and flip through it. That's basically space repetition. So you could use the fancy apps and stuff, but you don't necessarily need that. Okay. So one more thing. Sorry, I'm going to go back to tip number 2 before I move on, because this will kind of goes with space repetition. So this kind of ties tips 2 and 3 together. Is another reason why we are writing in phrases is it gives context. I kind of mentioned this, but I wanted to focus on it specifically. Is the context that it gives helps you remember those words. So when you are going back to review with your spaced repetition, it's easier to remember the words with the context from the other words around it. All right, so quickly want to touch on that. Next, we have active recall. Okay, this is what Anki is good at. Active recall and spaced repetition is pretty much the same thing, because what you're doing is you're recalling the words over different periods of time to remember them. But let me show you exactly. So what makes active recall a little different is spaced repetition is just reviewing the words, right? Just like, okay, this word, boom, boom, that means this. Active recall is more of like, and this is what Anki does naturally, where you can put a word on one side of they're basically like digital note cards. So you would put the Spanish word on one side of the note card and the English word on the other side of the note card, and it would serve them to you. Active recall would be hiding one side and saying, okay, what does this mean in English? Okay, reading it and quizzing yourself like that. Actually quizzing yourself, trying to actively recall. Now, a mistake a lot of people make is they always only do Spanish to English translation, even with Anki. But with Anki, you could do reverse sides. You can study both sides. But basically what both sides means is, how about you cover the Spanish side and you try to actively recall how to say this word in Spanish rather than how to say the Spanish word in English. It's much easier for us to remember because we wrote this in context. It's easier for us to remember the word, what the Spanish word means in English. It's harder to have to go the other way and go from English to Spanish. And that's why it's hard to speak Spanish, because essentially we have to, especially when we're getting started, we have to do that. We're naturally going to think in English first and then talk Spanish. We translate in our head. It's just what happens. It's just part of the process. Eventually, as you speak more, that you won't have to do that. But in the beginning, that's why it's hard to speak, because we're not good at actively recalling from our native language to a foreign language. So that's why people can read Spanish better than they can speak it, because one way you are reading and you are translating the words from Spanish to English, but when you're speaking, you're doing English to Spanish, which if you don't work on it, you're not going to be able to do it. So that should help you be able to do that. Now, the only time I recommend writing words down is through something called labeling. So what is labeling? Is when you basically, let me get this pen right here. We could say, like, I could write mesa and I could put it on my table. I can write micrófono and I can put on the microphone. I could write cuaderno and I could put cuaderno on my notebook. I could write pared on the wall and I could put this sticky on the wall. I can write espejo, and I can put sticky tab on the mirror. Now, if you're living with somebody that might think like, dude, what are you doing? You have all these sticky notes everywhere. But that can help you learn relevant vocabulary words, right? And it also takes care of the spaced repetition and active recall on its own, because every day you're seeing it, and it's like you're just consuming that piece of content. And then over time, you can pull that down and maybe leave a sticky note, like once you know the words, remove the sticky notes and put new sticky notes blank. And then you have to actively recall what that is. So you could say, oh, sticky note there, that's una mesa. Oh, sticky note here, that's un cuaderno. So those are things that you can do. Sticky notes, I love them. They're very good for especially more beginner stuff, but it's important. Another thing you could do is use different types of memory techniques, okay? One of my favorite techniques, I forgot the name of this book, but it was a book about how to like memorize. It wasn't language learning specific, but it was a good book about retaining information. And this helps with the active recall is, I think they call it mnemonic. Let me see, mnemonics, or you can use different ways to do it. But for example, one of my favorite methods from the book was you tie a word to a crazy image and it helps you remember it. So let's say, for example, the word manzana. Manzana means apple, but let's say we're struggling to remember this one word, manzana. What can we do? We will picture a man, manzana, man, manzana. We'll picture a man, a giant man with a big head that's an apple. So now, when it's time to remember that word, we'll say, how do you say apple? Big man with an apple head, manzana. It helps us recall the words by giving these images to the words. All right, it kind of gives us our own context. You could also think of like, okay, the word libro for book. You could think of a big book is the librarian sitting at the desk. So that'll help you remember librarian, big book, librarian, libro, okay? Let me see. I had another one down here. All right, no. So those are the main two quick examples that I had, but you can be creative. That's the whole point, is to be creative. I think in the book, he actually mentioned like, oh, if you had to remember the word tigre, which means tiger, tigre, you could think of a big tiger, what do you say, drinking gray tea or something crazy like that. But it helps you remember like, oh, big tiger drinking tea that's gray, tigre. All right, so you can use little techniques like that can help you remember the words. Last one is when you're doing all this memorization, this is the last tip, when you're doing all this active recall, spaced repetition, say the words out loud, okay? Because that's going to help you reinforce your memory recall. So when I write down a phrase, I'm going to read that whole phrase and I'm going to emphasize the word. So, voy a hablar contigo. Voy a hablar contigo. I'm going to talk with you. I'm going to speak with you. When you're going through your journal, don't just say these things in your head. Read them out loud. Saying them out loud is going to help your pronunciation, of course. It's going to get you used to saying Spanish words. It's one thing to have them in your head. It's another thing to actually speak. And it's going to help you recall the words. All right, so those are my 7 tips for improving your memorization, for helping you retain new words in Spanish, which is very, very important. And one thing I'll add is it kind of ties back to the first tip, which the first tip ties everything together, is that you have to consume a lot of Spanish, right? To be able to do any of the other tips, you have to consume a lot of Spanish. And that's, of course, very important. But the key here is deliberately writing down the phrases. That kind of starts everything, because then you'll be able to do spaced repetition. Then you'll be able to do active recall. Then you'll be able to do memory techniques. Then you'll be able to repeat out loud. So take it back to the basics, okay? Consume a lot of content. That's the best way. So if you enjoyed this video, if you found it helpful and you're looking for some consumption, you're looking for a way to really make some big strides in your Spanish, definitely check out our training where I show you my 3 biggest secrets to learn Spanish faster. I'll put the link in the comments for you. Just click that link. Basically, these 3 secrets are like, if I had to learn Spanish from scratch again, like all over, if I had to learn Spanish all over from scratch, these are the main 3 things I would do. So definitely check that out. It's in the description and it's in the comments pinned for you. So go click that link and check it out. Yeah, if you liked the video, do me a big favor, hit the thumbs up for me. Comment below, let me know what else you need help with, anything. You know I got you. Last but not least, please do not forget to subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you never miss another video. Hasta la próxima, ¿ve? Nos fuimos.